Well, welcome everyone to the Wealthy Speaker Podcast. Hey, have you ever had to speak on a topic that was like delicate or tricky? My client, Gregg Brown, is here to talk to us about just that. Welcome to the show, Gregg Brown.
Thank you, Jane. It's good to be here on a Monday, I think it is.
Well, we're recording on a Monday.
That's true.
Now, tell everybody about your current business model.
Well, I've been a speaker for many, many years, and currently it's all virtual. I had all my in-person engagements cancel in the fall, and I was looking forward to
You
those.
are in Canada. Let's establish that. Do you
I
do
am.
a lot of your work in Canada, or are you both
I
straddling?
do, I do about 50% in Canada, about 50 in the rest of the world. So I do a bunch of stuff virtually right now in Europe.
Yeah.
And then there's some sort of broken out into Europe, and I have a trip to Austria in January. So hopefully that happens for work. And then the rest is in the US. So yeah.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. And so talk about what kinds of things that you do in your business on a day to day. You do training, you do keynotes, talk about the whole scope.
Yeah, so I would say the majority of my business right now would be keynotes, and I always do little interactive ones when they're virtual because I don't believe people can sit and listen for an
Yeah.
hour to me, go on. No matter how good the stories are, the takeaways, they might as well just watch it on YouTube.
Yeah.
So, my belief is people really need to be engaged, in the process. So,
Mhm.
whether, in a keynote, it's obviously going to be more inspirational and aspirational than say, a workshop or a webinar. But I'd probably say 5% are keynotes right now, and the others are workshops that I do. And I'm very lucky. I get 99% of my business through referral and word of mouth. And yeah, so it's good. And then my stuff that I do on the side, which is what we're talking about today, is I tend to coach speakers, which just happened organically,
Mhm.
on speaking on tricky types of topics that people might have some judgments about or not. And the challenge, I think with speakers is since we don't think that people may have judgments about the stuff we've done or the language that we use.
Okay, so give us an example of some of the tricky topics that you've discussed over the years.
Well, I can tell you the ones that I used to teach. So the reason I think people come to me, and because speakers bureaus sometimes refer people to me, is I started well, the second part of my career, my first part of my career, I was part of the team that opened the first wave of Starbucks in Canada. And that's where I sort of got the training speaking bug.
Okay.
But then I spent a big bulk of my time as a sexual health educator. So I would teach people, professionals and volunteers usually, um, about sexual health. And that, of course, has a lot of stuff around it. So I had to learn how to frame things. So I sort of figure, the principles that I use to do that so people could hear me are relevant for topics that people come to me for, which could be something as similar. They want to tell a story about quitting smoking and then they alienate the audience.
Right.
Or where they talk about maybe losing weight and they've alienated the audience, or where they had a boss that was a certain personality type and half that personality type is in the audience,
Mm.
or a diversity speaker who may use language that they don't mean to, but unfortunately where they might label people with the isms or the phobias, or when we try to tell people parts of our story that someone who, there's a great speaker I worked with who had an addiction to cocaine, and she used to get up and say that, and
Hmm.
of course she annihilated the whole audience, except the story is so funny and so good she wanted to use it, so I had to help her frame it in a way that made it useful. So it could be a range of anything.
Right. And with mental health,
Mm-hmm.
really, a little bit further along in Canada in terms of talking about it openly. But with mental health starting to become a big wave around the rest of the world as well, even little language
Yeah.
issues like talking the word crazy is a trigger. It's
Yes.
a hot
Yes.
button for people. And so there's a lot of things as speakers that you just have to have an awareness about. The gender thing, not only male, female, he, she, they, all of that, but how easy it is for a man to say something that just rubs a woman the wrong way, right?
Yeah, or even language that we use. I've had, I had a speaker I worked with who she told a story, and it was a really good story, so I wanted her to use it, about going to church. Now, the unfortunate thing is, if you say that to, certainly here in Canada, the US is a little different, but you say it here in Canada, and the group had comments on their evaluations about that. So she had to frame it in a way that was, this is what I like to do. I like to go to church on Sundays. You may choose to go somewhere else or do something else.
Yeah.
That's okay. Then
Yeah.
she was able to bring everybody into the dialogue.
Right. Right. Just by saying something that simple
Absolutely.
could really turn an audience off. And I think that this is just a great conversation to have. So maybe one of the tips we could give people is just kind of go through your presentation and look for danger zones, identify what they are, maybe type out what you're going to say. We don't always type out every single
No.
word that we're going to say in a speech, but maybe when you're in a gray zone, you plot it out a little bit more carefully. Is that how you help people?
Well, I think I would even take it a step back from that,
Okay.
because what you think is a safe zone, your audience might not think is a safe zone. They
Ah,
might think it's a gray zone. So, because what, language I use might offend someone else, or, how I frame the story might offend someone else. So what I suggest is, I believe that, all of us as speakers are trying to create change on the planet, or we wouldn't do our jobs. We wouldn't be here doing it. It's not just to fulfill our ego needs that want to happen to get up on stage or go virtual.
yeah.
If you really want people to hear you, the first piece I say is, the influence and the uptake and the takeaways happens in the mind of the other person. It's
Mhm.
not about you. So get into the mind of your audience and go through your stories and your content and go, okay, I'm going to say this. What do I think they might be their objections to it?
Yeah.
So it's looking at objections to anything we say. So it might be, one of the things I'll say is when I talk about, grounding our conversation, when I'm speaking and talking about, grounding worries and risks. I have to say, I do say worries are made up stories. And then I have to say, because the objection to that is, I'm not saying don't listen to people's worries, but if you want to problem solve,
Right.
ground them in facts. See, I have to look at it, and it is about starting with, what the audience think is a gray zone, and what do I think could be a gray zone would be number two for me.
Right. And where in your own business and career
Mhm.
have you learned this lesson? What was a time when you stepped in it?
Oh, well, I mean, I got many. I mean, I can go back, 25, 30 years when, I was teaching sexual health and think, language and words to people in a professional setting that people had really only heard in the schoolyard before,
Mm,
and I really had to learn that, because what would happen is I'd sort of jump into, the workshop, and it might have been an hour to a 3-hour workshop with a group of 25 or 50 people. And I'd jump right into the heavy duty stuff without creating the bridge that people needed to do to get there.
mm.
So, I remember at times just sort of jumping right in with this group of nurses, and they were just all looking at me like deer in the headlights because I started talking about all those body parts between the neck and the knees.
Yeah.
And and it was hard for them, and I think, I learned that in order for people to get into any type of difficult topic, that they really needed to not feel safe, but they needed to feel that there was a bridge that I could take them on that would bring them over to where I needed them to hear me. And it's I always think of, all of us as speakers, regardless of what content we teach, we have to build that bridge.
Right.
whether you're a sales speaker, you have to build a bridge between you and your audience. So it doesn't matter if it's a tricky topic or not. How do we build that bridge, take them to where we need to get to, and then, do the reveal of whatever it is, and I'm not saying water down your stories. See, I identified an objection there. I'm not saying water down your stories, but do the reveal when people can hear it.
Okay, so the nurses,
Mm-hmm.
get them to this place where you have a dialogue going
Mm-hmm.
about sexual health.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do in the after version? So clearly the before version, you took them there too quickly. You just
Yeah.
dove right in. Come on,
Yeah.
everybody, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
And they're like, no. And so what would the after version look like?
So the difference was, I went through afterwards and I went through and looked at the language, how I was going to frame it, how I could create the relatability around it. Because the reality is this, if I'm going to talk about sex, which I do tell a funny story on stage about teaching sexual health to nuns, and it's a funny story and it's a good story with the great outcome that's relatable to everyone. And I had to figure out how to teach that, and speak to it on stage,
right?
Because there could be objections to Catholic sisters and this and this,
right.
But with the nurses, it was about bringing them in and talking about, hey, well, what we're going to do today? We're going to talk about those body parts, not your head or your feet, but the kind between your neck and your knees.
Yeah.
So just be prepared. We're going to talk about that. And you may think you've never talked about those before, but you did on the schoolyard when you were kids, and then everybody laughs.
Right.
Then we were able to get into some of the safer words first, and then go into some of the heavier ones later. Right. Okay. But so the trick is, I don't believe there's much net new on the planet not to denigrate any speaker, but our goal as speakers is to relate somehow. And once we create the relatability, then we can do the reveal of the new content, regardless of your topic.
Okay.
That's my philosophy.
Okay. So if what is the outcome if speakers don't frame their stories and content so that people can kind of listen in that non-judgmental way?
Well, I think what happens is people disengage. They get hit with. I saw a speaker years ago, and it was at a professional conference, and she came out and started talking about sexual abuse and things. And 50% of people really loved the conversation, but 50% of us were like, whoa, wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
And it was too soon in the dialogue for that. So I wanted to have been brought in a little more. So I think whether it's language, whether it's the story, whether it's how we frame it, whatever that can alienate folks, we want to really, do that in a way, because if we alienate people, it's so hard to get them back. And you don't have the time in an hour.
So really thinking about the first words out of your mouth are designed to start building that bridge with your audience and start to have them relate to you. How do you open your presentations in a way that starts to pave the path to trickier topics?
Well, I think, one of the pieces of coaching I gave to this speaker who spoke about her cocaine addiction on stage was, I'm always one of those people who's like, I wouldn't talk about that. Yeah. But it's actually very funny, and the way she tells it now is very good. And it has a great point that we can all relate to.
Right. So
she opened with something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing because she says it better than I do. Sure. But she says something like, now I'm sure you've all had a bag of chips or a box of popcorn at the movie theater, or if your favorite chocolate bar in front of you and you don't know when to stop. Can I see a show of hands? Or she doesn't do the show of hands, but something like that. She won't see the nodding of heads. So she doesn't see
our addictions, right?
She doesn't use that word, but
yes, but I understand where she's going.
Yeah, and she says, there's all the, some of you probably like to eat a lot of French fries. Some of you probably like to work too much. Some of you might like to drive fast. Well, I like to do a white powder. The type you put up your nose. Now, some of you might have thought it's not a big deal, but for me, it was a problem. And then she gets into her story, and then she'll be like, and I know you can all relate to that if your hand's gone into the bag of chips or the cookie jar.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
everybody laughs. So she can take them on that journey now.
Okay, that's interesting. Very interesting. So building bridges,
Hmm.
your content, with your stories, so that your audience can take action. You got
Hmm.
like a tip or two that would help people build bridges?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to think about, and we talked about this earlier, from the audience's point of view, what are the pieces of what I'm talking about that they could have judgment about?
Hmm.
So it can be something as simple as this. If you get up and talk about, you know, my CEO, was very directive and was always on my back to get my work done. And I found it a problem. I'm in the audience going, I actually think that's a good thing. So you've alienated me right there. Like it's a very
Right,
simple thing. So I'm
right.
not saying water it down. What I am saying is frame it in a way that goes, well, some of you might not have had a problem with it. I did, because it just goes against who I am.
Yeah,
And
right.
so it is about that relatability. And a quote that really stands out for me. Sorry, I have to have a quote because I speak on this stuff.
Sure.
Rumi, the 12th century mystic, Sufi mystic, said this. He said,
Mhm.
out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And
Mm.
I believe it's our job as speakers to get people to this field by thinking about everything I talk about. How can the audience relate to it? How can they relate? Because everyone's had something similar happen to them in some way, whether it's a topic, whether it's an Olympian talking about them winning a race. I mean,
Mm.
I remember as a kid trying to win a race. Like there's that part attached to it. So think about all of the different ways that people can relate, brainstorm, make a list, and then pick the ones that you think would be most relevant for that audience, because we want to create that trajectory. And every story might have a different trajectory. Yes, there's story patterns, create the characters, set the context, blah, blah, blah. I believe when you're talking about, topics that can be tricky and have different things attached to them or beliefs attached to them and judgments, the trajectory might look a little different.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so I remember a time when I was working with Vince Pacenti, and he would get up on a chair to demonstrate the sport of the Olympic sport of speed skiing. So it's like
I love that.
150 miles an hour downhill on skis, and he
Yes.
stood on a chair in order to, and had it like his um, what you call it, ski poles, tucked underneath his arm,
Yes.
and he demonstrated that. Well, on the demo video, we
Yeah.
had that further back, and because based on a fear-based decision, I was worried that people would think it was too out there, that people would think it was too, kooky
Wild.
and too wild, and they somehow wouldn't book him. But interestingly enough, when we just said, look, let's just show them what it is, we put it up front, that became his differentiator. And it ended up working out very, very nicely. Now, there were a few places where Vince liked to dance with trouble.
I love the dance with trouble. That's a great way to say it.
Including when he would imitate a French judge at the Olympics, right? So now
Yeah.
anybody with any kind of French blood, kind of gets. Anyway,
And I do
but
believe, when we tell,
he had a joke, I think, to balance that off.
yeah.
I think it was about how he was half Irish and half French, which meant he'd be a great lover if he was ever sober. Like something just silly like that.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
was his way of saying, look, I'm French. I can make fun of the French or something like that. So,
And that's a tough one.
yeah, it really is. Now, maybe that joke offended people too. I don't know. Like, I felt like we were always kind of in a little bit of a danger zone.
Well,
But
I think you're right. Anytime we take on any, cultural components, and, the challenge, I think, and, I see this with some diversity speakers I've worked with, it's when people are very passionate about their topic, so it doesn't even need to be diversity, but speakers are generally passionate about their topic. And when people get passionate, sometimes that level of activism for their topic, which I think is necessary, don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but I think it's necessary. I think it's not necessarily the right place on stage for it, because we want to bring people in. And if you say something like, this language is racist, the language might be racist, so I'm just saying, yes, it might be, and that's okay. Yet if I was on stage talking about that, I would probably frame it as, that language can be interpreted as that,
Right.
because it takes away the labeling,
The label.
and we want to use tentative language without watering down our message,
Right.
so that people,
So,
if we're too direct, sometimes people can't hear us.
right. Okay, I hear what you're saying. Okay, if we're too direct, sometimes people can't hear us. Okay,
Yeah.
so I have a new client who had one of the longest running careers in the NFL.
Hmm.
And his backstory is one that is kind of like a rough upbringing. And
Cool.
so I wonder, Greg, I'm workshopping this idea with
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
You can open, because the person who's just introduced him has said accolade, accolade, accolade,
Yeah.
fame in this way, fame in this way. So, can he open up and talk about this right away, or does he need to build a rapport with the audience first before he goes there?
Well, it depends how he talks about it,
Okay.
right? So he could open with that,
Hmm.
and I would frame it in a way that was very tentative. So I would frame it something like, we've all had different upbringings.
Yeah.
Some of you may have had upbringings like this. Some of you may have had upbringings like this. Some of you may have had upbringings in the middle somewhere. Well,
Yeah.
my upbringing was way over here.
Yeah.
Do you want to hear a little bit about it?
Yeah, that's good. And
And then people will be like,
yeah.
okay. And then when you tell that, though, like, there's a story I tell depending on the audience, where, you know, I always thought I came from a middle class family till my mother was dying. And I said to my mom on her deathbed, I said, Mom, why did we have a white dog named Coco? And my mom, who was brought up in a very wealthy family, but they didn't have money by the time she'd gotten married back in the 60s. So, people always thought she had more money than she had. But so I said, why do we have a white dog named Coco? And she said, well, I couldn't very well call him Cocaine. I was like, well, why would we call him Cocaine? And she said, well, that was Patty's name for her dog. And Patty's boyfriend was head of the Hells Angels that lived on our street. I'm like, we had Hells Angels on our street?
Yeah, you
Like,
have.
I had no idea. But it's a story that sets context that I can make funny because of my humor.
Hmm.
Whereas, so whoever, anyone's listening, I would say, don't copy me, but find what works for you, that
Right.
you can tell the story in a way that makes it light enough and heavy enough that your message is there. Because if I just started off and said, grew up really poor, I didn't know I was really poor, I lived on the street with the Hells Angels,
Hmm.
and this is what was going on, people are like, wah wah wah, tell me another one.
Right.
So I think he can start off with that, and I think it's about how he frames that recognizes that everyone in the audience has different experiences. Some might have similar to him, and I can guarantee you they do.
Yes, I'm sure there are people in the audience that would relate to that.
Absolutely.
Sure. And knowing that you're not going to keep them down in the well of despair for too
Yeah.
long, you're going to pop them back up and you're going to bring them to a really nice place. And I think that that's important too. Okay, so I have one more interesting thing to workshop with you. It's the
Sure.
male female dynamic. So
Yeah.
one of my clients thought he was doing women a solid by making the woman in the story the boss.
Okay.
But it turned out that she was having some challenges with her leadership style. And I
Oh,
think you're already in hot water there because women know that, when they're assertive, they're called the B
they're,
word, and yet their male counterparts could do exactly the same.
they're assertive and
They're
they're,
assertive, right? Exactly. And so I think he was trying to do the right thing by making the boss a woman, but at the same time it didn't come off well. And
well,
so
mhm.
how do you do an example of a boss that's not doing the leadership style that you might want to
So
see?
I would frame it exactly what you said. So I use a story like that.
Yeah.
So I will say something like, to set up the story, say, well, y'all know this. Women are perceived very differently than men when they're in their positions of power. And it's not a word that I use, but I've heard them be called the B word just because they're assertive. And yet, me, I'm allowed to be as mean and nasty as I want, and everybody thinks I'm great.
Right. Right.
So,
I'm
and
just
and
being a
so
good leader. Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, so I can set it up that context and say, my story is about having a woman leader like that, but I did not think she was like that. And this came out in sexual health workshops because for the all throughout history of time, women have to be a certain way when they're married, and men get to carry on and be the studs of the world. So
Mm,
that dynamic has existed forever, and it's very much still in the workplace. So I just acknowledge that. I'm like, you know what? This is the perception, this and this and this, and I know it, and you know it, and that's not what I'm speaking about in this
okay,
context.
fair enough. So I think showing that you understand is an
Well,
important first step.
well, you
But
hit the
also,
pot with this though, which I think is really important that we haven't talked about. Is when we're speaking, whether it's about leadership, sales, any talk, whether it's sexual health I used to talk about, or whether it's smoking or eating or whatever, it's really taking a big picture view of what, and this isn't about judgments, it's society's view of what that is. Like you're really saying, what's that big picture context? So women are considered this, men are considered that's a big picture context that you need to acknowledge. And I think any topic, whether it's same with aging, like you talk about aging, and sometimes I talk about quitting smoking, which is again a steering away, but I frame it in a way that if I could still smoke, I would, which is true. I still smoke 2 packs of Marlboros a day, and I always frame it and say, if you still smoke, that's okay. I'd probably come out to the smoking area and just smell your smoke with you, and it just makes people safe so they know I'm not judging
gotcha.
them.
Your goal is to not be perceived as judging people. Okay, so
To do something different than you, because
final
everyone has a choice.
final question
Mm,
is, if you are a speaker, times have changed.
mm, mm.
And many would say that the pendulum has swung so far now that we're borderline, everything has become a hot button issue. Everything, right? A lot of things are polarizing, especially if you're working in the States. There's a lot of gray area that you could find in your presentation. What do you say to the people who are like, man, I feel like there's minefields everywhere today.
Well,
No, this is the business that we're
that
in.
we're in. Yeah.
So,
And I think it's about, finding out what the minefields is for the audience or sector that you're talking to. I mean, it's one of the questions I always ask. Like, is
yes.
there anything I shouldn't talk about? Any issues going on? Blah, blah,
That,
blah. Any language I
that's
shouldn't use?
gold, everybody. If you're tuning in, write this down and put it on your pre-program questionnaire. Are there any hot button or sensitive topics that we shouldn't talk about? Because in a company, things have happened. And you need to know what those things are so that you can steer clear of them, right?
And sometimes, I had to speak. Can't remember what city I was in. I was in the US. I was doing the opening keynote at a conference in the US the day after the American election in 2016,
Oh,
that morning. And I had to address it. I
yeah.
could not address it.
The elephant in the room.
I
And we
had
do
to,
that. right?
And
We have to.
yeah, I had to, because I was talking about change.
Mm,
And when we're hit with disruptive change, I had to do it in a way that didn't get into politics.
mhm.
And, I spent the morning, I was up at 5 a.m. going, what am I going to do? And
Yes.
I had to ground it in brain science, in how you can't fight emotion with facts and you can't fight facts with emotion.
Mm.
And I found some examples that were global from various political parties. It didn't matter whether, you were a liberal or a conservative or a Republican or a Democrat or a left or a right or a middle. I found some examples that illustrated what I was saying and was able to sort of bring it, but it took a good 3 hours of work that morning. So, you
Wow.
know,
So
sometimes
just
we're
as an
some,
interesting little point, we have our election today. Is it today or tomorrow? I
it's
already
today.
voted in advance, and it took completely just I forgot about it. And I think that is we started talking about it maybe 5 weeks ago, because that's when the election was called.
Mhm.
They did it very speedily, some could
Yeah.
say not very well, but anyway, regardless, it's done. 5 weeks and we're finished, and I bet you most people have already voted. So it's like, it's not the biggest thing in the world that's going to be on everybody's lips today.
No,
Will be the election. it's
no.
it's so funny what the difference is between Canada and the United States in terms of that. And I guess my point is, when you're out there on the stage, that is just such a slippery slope
It
that
is.
I would
And
never
it's,
go there.
well, and the current, of course, conversation is around vaccines and COVID.
Yeah.
And the brain science thing still holds true. You can't fight emotion with fact.
Yeah.
And because I speak on change, I see it at a meta level. And yet it's, if it did come up, at some point, someone asked me a question, and sometimes, I get people try to pull down, me as a speaker down the road and say, what do you do if management is a, loser management?
Yeah.
And then I have to sort of say, well, it all starts with each of us, but they try to pull you down that path, and you have to have, a way to ground yourself in, the real world of your work, so you don't get pulled there.
Hmm.
And I think that's very wise with what you were saying related to that.
Yeah. Well, sorry, that was just an interesting thing. I just remembered that there was the election was today, and here we were kind of not even definitely addressing it or thinking about it.
No.
Gregg Brown, Tricky Conversations. If people want to get in touch with you for some tricky conversation coaching, what might they do?
They just need to go to bechangeready.com, and they can get a hold of me right through there. So just
That's
the way it
awesome.
sounds. Yeah.
Gregg Brown, by the way, Greg spelt with two G's, actually three G's, Greggg. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I hope everybody will be going through kind of line by line
Yes.
their presentation with a new eye for saying, could somebody judge this? Could I get past somebody's judgment on this? Am I clarifying that? Am I teeing it up in a way that is open and honest and allows people not to hate me just for saying this one thing? Be aware of what might get you into hot water.
Absolutely. And what you want people to listen to. I really believe not to bring stuff to the stage that's not healed and that you haven't worked through.
Yeah.
And yet, if it's important,
Not therapy. Yes.
yeah, it's not therapy. But if it's something that's good and relevant, don't shy away from it. Don't shy away, but find the interesting takeaway. And remember, if you set the language, if you frame it, if you create that relatability, and then time your reveal around what the real dirt is, and remind similarities again, and do some takeaways, you'll have them in the palm of your hand. And that's what we all want as speakers.
Beautiful. Gregg Brown, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Those of you listening in, hey, let us know if something resonated. Let us know if something annoyed you on
Yeah.
today's show. I want to know about that too. And I haven't been asking a lot of that. So I'm going to ask for that now. And with that, we're going to say, see you soon, wealthy speakers. Bye for now, everyone.